They weren't supposed to disappear this fast, and yet they did. Some of the most unforgettable 80s cartoons didn't fail. They were cut off mid-story. So what actually happened behind the scenes? Because the truth isn't what you think. These shows weren't canceled for being bad. They were canceled for reasons no one was paying attention to. And once you see the pattern, you can't unsee it. Visionaries, Knights of the Magical Light, 1987. It looked like the future. And that's exactly why it didn't last. At a glance, Visionaries felt like a breakthrough. Knights with holographic powers, technology merging with magic. A world where science collapsed, and something older took its place. It wasn't just another action cartoon, it was trying to build a mythology. But here's what most viewers never realized. The show wasn't really the product, the toys were. And when those holographic toys failed to sell the way the company expected, everything changed instantly. Storylines didn't matter. Characters didn't matter. Even the world they were building didn't matter. Because once the sales dropped, the show had already lost. 13 episodes. That's all it got. And what makes it worse is what was coming next. The story was expanding. The conflict between technology and magic was just beginning to deepen. There were hints of something bigger, something that could have evolved far beyond a typical cartoon, but it never got the chance. Because in the 80s, a show didn't survive on audience love. It survived on numbers. And Visionaries became one of the clearest examples of a harsh reality most viewers never saw. Sometimes, the story isn't canceled. It's abandoned. Spiral Zone, 1987. It didn't feel like a kid's cartoon. And that was the problem. Spiral Zone dropped viewers into something darker than expected. A poisoned world. A creeping, toxic fog turning people into controlled, emotionless servants. And the only ones who could fight back were soldiers wearing specialized suits just to survive. This wasn't colorful escapism. It was controlled dread. And audiences felt it immediately. But here's what worked against it. It asked too much from its viewers. Instead of simple heroes and villains, it built tension around environment, strategy, and survival. It leaned into atmosphere instead of fast-paced action. And for a younger audience expecting something lighter, that tone created distance. But what most people missed at the time is how ahead of its concept it really was. Today, dystopian storytelling dominates entertainment. Toxic worlds, controlled populations, isolated resistance forces. Spiral Zone was already doing it, years before it became mainstream. And yet, it lasted only one season, because it didn't match expectations. Not because it failed, but because it didn't fit. And in a decade driven by formulas, that difference became its downfall. Pole Position, 1984. It looked like a racing cartoon, until you realized it wasn't. Pole Position starts simple. Fast cars, competitive races, high-speed action. Everything feels exactly where it should be. And then something shifts. The cars talk, they think, they analyze. They assist like partners, not machines. And suddenly, this isn't just about racing anymore. It's about technology, family dynamics, and secret missions operating beneath the surface. But that shift created a problem, because viewers didn't know what they were watching. Was it action? Was it sci-fi? Was it a family show? It tried to be all three. And in doing that, it lost clarity. What makes this cancellation more interesting is that the concept itself wasn't weak. It was just ahead of its time. Today, AI-driven characters and talking machines are everywhere, but in the early 80s, it felt unfamiliar, even confusing. So audiences didn't fully connect, and when connection drops, so do ratings. One season, and it was over, not because it lacked ideas, but because it introduced them too early for people to understand. The Galaxy High School, 1986. It should have been easy to watch, but it wasn't easy to accept. Galaxy High sounds simple. Take high school drama and place it in space. Different species, different cultures, endless creative possibilities. And on the surface, it delivered exactly that. But underneath, something felt different. The tone wasn't straightforward comedy. It wasn't pure adventure either. It lived in an uncomfortable middle space, awkward, experimental, sometimes even emotionally uneven. And that's where things started to slip. Because audiences in the 80s expected clarity. They wanted to know exactly what kind of show they were watching within seconds. Galaxy High didn't give them that. It challenged expectations instead. What makes this more fascinating is how modern the idea feels today. Diverse characters, outsider perspectives, social dynamics in unfamiliar environments. These are now standard storytelling tools. Back then, they felt unusual, so despite having strong creative backing and a concept with long-term potential, it lasted just one season, because sometimes being different isn't enough. If the audience doesn't recognize what you are immediately, they move on. Jace and the Wheeled Warriors, 1985. It wasn't just a show, it was a chase with no ending. From the first episode, Jace gives you a mission, a missing father, a dangerous enemy, a journey that feels like it's building towards something bigger. And that's what made it addictive. Every episode felt like progress. But here's the part no one tells you up front. There was never going to be an ending, at least not the one viewers expected. The show was built around a continuous narrative, rare for the time. It didn't reset each episode. It moved forward, and that created a deeper investment from viewers who wanted resolution. But when the show was canceled, that resolution disappeared with it. The father was never found. The journey never finished. And that unfinished story became its legacy. Because unlike other cartoons that simply ended, this one stopped, mid-search, mid-purpose, mid-story. And that creates a different kind of memory. Not closure, but absence. Silverhawks, 1986. It felt like something bigger, but it never expanded the way it should have. Silverhawks arrived with immediate impact, metallic heroes, space-based warfare, and a sleek, futuristic tone that separated it from everything else on television at the time. It wasn't grounded like typical action cartoons. It aimed higher. A galaxy full of threats, a team enhanced beyond human limits, and a villain who felt powerful enough to sustain long-term conflict. Visually, it worked. The character designs were sharp, memorable, almost iconic. The music added energy. The world felt open, like it could go anywhere at any time. But that promise slowly started to stall. Because while the surface looked strong, the depth underneath wasn't evolving. Episodes began to repeat patterns instead of building momentum. Conflicts reset instead of escalating. And over time, that created a quiet disconnect. Viewers weren't losing interest instantly. They were drifting away gradually. And that's the most dangerous kind of decline, because you don't notice it happening until it's already too late. And what makes this more frustrating is the potential that was clearly there. The show hinted at larger arcs, deeper character relationships, and a universe that could have expanded far beyond its original scope. But those ideas were never fully explored. They stayed as fragments, possibilities that never turned into reality. And when ratings began to weaken, there wasn't enough progression to pull audiences back in. So after just one season, it ended. Not because it failed completely, but because it stayed in place while everything around it was moving forward. And in the 80s, standing still was often the fastest way to disappear. Mask, 1985. It looked like a guaranteed success. And for a moment, it actually was. Mask had the perfect formula. Transforming vehicles, secret identities, fast-paced missions, and a clear battle between opposing forces. It wasn't confusing, it wasn't experimental. It gave audiences exactly what they expected, and it delivered it with consistency. From the outside, everything pointed toward longevity. Strong concept, recognizable characters, a structure that could easily continue for years. And for a while, it worked exactly as planned. But behind that success, something else was driving the show, something most viewers never considered. Because Mask wasn't just entertainment, it was part of a system built around product cycles, not storytelling. And once that system shifted, everything changed with it. The toy line, which played a central role in the show's existence, began to slow down. New trends emerged, market attention moved elsewhere, and suddenly, The foundation holding the show in place wasn't as stable as it seemed. That's when the shift happened. Quietly, without warning. Because when the numbers dropped behind the scenes, the future of the show was already decided. It didn't matter that the concept still worked. It didn't matter that the audience was still engaged. The decision wasn't being made on screen. It was being made somewhere else entirely. And that's what makes this cancellation feel different. It wasn't a creative failure. It wasn't a loss of interest. It was a strategic removal. The audience didn't walk away from the show. The system walked away from the audience. And once that happens, there's nothing left to hold it in place. Dungeons and Dragons, 1983. It promised a way home, and that promise is what kept people watching. From the very first episode, the direction was clear. A group of ordinary kids suddenly pulled into a dangerous fantasy world, forced to survive in an environment they didn't understand. Every step they took had meaning. Every encounter felt like it was moving them closer to something important. Because this wasn't just a series of adventures, it was a journey with a destination. Getting back home. And that single goal created something rare. It gave the show emotional weight. Viewers weren't just watching what happened next, they were waiting for something to resolve, waiting for the moment everything would come together. But that moment never arrived. Because just as the story was building toward something larger, it stopped. The final episode, the one that was meant to answer everything, was never properly produced. No resolution. No return, just an unfinished path left hanging in place. And that's what changed how the show was remembered, because most canceled cartoons fade away over time. They end and people move on. But this didn't end. It paused. And that pause never resumed. The characters remained trapped in that world, not just within the story, but within the audience's memory. And that creates a different kind of impact, not closure, but absence. A missing piece that never fully disappears. And decades later, that absence still feels the same. Because once a story promises an ending and never delivers it, it stops being just a show. It becomes something unresolved. Thunder the Barbarian, 1980. It didn't look like a kid's cartoon, and that's exactly why it stood out. From the moment it begins, Thundar places you in a world that feels broken, not playful, not safe. A future shaped by destruction, where remnants of civilization exist alongside sorcery, mutated creatures, and unpredictable danger. It wasn't polished or comforting. It felt rough, unstable, almost hostile in the way it presented its world. And that difference made it unforgettable. Because while most cartoons of the time leaned toward simplicity and familiarity, this one leaned into something heavier, something more uncertain. But that choice came with consequences. The tone didn't align with what networks were trying to maintain. It didn't fit neatly into a programming block designed for consistency and broad appeal. It stood apart. And that separation made it harder to sustain, even though the storytelling was strong, even though the world felt unique. It didn't match the expectations being placed on it. And in that environment, fitting in often mattered more than standing out. So despite having the elements needed for long-term success, it only lasted 2 seasons. And what remains today isn't just nostalgia for what it was. It's recognition of what it attempted. A cartoon that didn't follow the rules others depended on. A show that chose atmosphere over comfort. And in doing that, it revealed something important. That sometimes being different is enough to be remembered, but not enough to survive. The Pirates of Dark Water, 1991. It didn't end. It disappeared at the exact moment it was becoming something bigger. From the first episode, The Pirates of Dark Water feels different in a way that's hard to ignore. The world is larger. The story is deeper. And most importantly, it has direction. This isn't episodic storytelling designed to reset every week. It's a continuous journey, one that moves forward, piece by piece, toward a clear goal. Stopping the dark water. And that structure changes everything. Because instead of watching isolated adventures, the audience becomes part of a progression. Each episode matters. Each step builds on the last. And that creates investment. Real investment. The kind that keeps viewers coming back, not just for entertainment, but for resolution. But before that resolution could arrive, everything stopped. No final episode, no conclusion, no explanation, just silence. And that silence is what makes this cancellation different from the rest. Because most shows fade out gradually, ratings drop, interest declines, and eventually they disappear. But this didn't feel like a natural ending. It felt like an interruption, a story cut off mid-sentence, and once you recognize that, it changes how you see it. This wasn't just a canceled cartoon. It was an unfinished narrative that clearly had somewhere to go, but never got there. And that creates something rare, not just disappointment, but a lasting sense of incompletion. Because when a story is taken away before it reaches its end, it doesn't just disappear. It stays unfinished. They weren't forgotten because they were bad. They were remembered because they almost became something more. And that's what makes them different. Because once you see how many stories were cut short, you start to wonder how many of your favorites were never meant to end this way.